Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown Bag. As you know, we're kind of in a strange time. So this is the Women's Studies intern team, and my name is Allie Fry. I'm the Women's Studies program assistant here, and we've been in a strange place too as a team because half of us were in Canada. We didn't run away. That was planned long before we even knew Trump was nominated. And for the National Women's Studies Conference, and yesterday was kind of the first time when we could all kind of gather and meet and collect our thoughts about what's going on campus, what's going on nationally. And so I want to give a shout out to Ms. Kasakta, who's our Women's Health intern, and Ashley Opoku is our LGBTQ and Multicultural Affairs intern, but they can't be here today. And we also work very closely in conjunction with the LGBTQ interns. So if you're here, do you want to raise your hand for an intern if you feel comfortable? Yeah, because they're awesome. So shout out to them. These are the teams that make everything we do possible. They make Brown Bags possible. They make just our whole world go round here. So they're really important to us. And so together we all wrote this statement that we want to just share with you. And we'll post it on our Facebook page after we read it with you.
Okay, so before we share the statement, we just wanted to say that we wrote it before all of the hateful social media posts that we all saw yesterday. That doesn't change the sentiments of our statement, nor does it excuse the fact that we're all implicated in the campus climate, regardless of whether we were involved in hateful grouping posts. So, the Center for Women's Studies intern team would like to share our vision of what moving forward means to us.
We envision the center as a space where we aim to be our authentic selves.
To embody this vision, we welcome anger, rage, frustration, annoyance, fear, disappointment, and pain.
We hold space for people who do not see unity with those who are violently denied their humanity as an immediate possibility.
We ask of ourselves and our communities to recognize that we are at very different positionalities and points in our activism, and that we are not all impacted by our current socio-political context in the same ways or to the same degrees.
People of color, trans and queer people, undocumented people, Muslims, women, disabled people, and especially those at the intersections are especially vulnerable. Our privileged identities impact how actually vulnerable we are.
We recognize that this has been, is, and will continue to be lifelong, ongoing work. We're in it for the long haul, and we hope you are too. Okay, now for our regular intro. Welcome to Women's Studies. My name is Rachel, and I'm the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence intern at Women's Studies. If you don't know the person you're sitting next to, please take a quick moment to say hello. Okay, we want to begin. We want to begin by recognizing that we are on occupied land. This is Haudenosaunee land. You can sign up for the links to outreach on the clipboard, which is right here. Today at 2 p.m. outside the Hop, you can catch a free bus to Hamilton College for their Love Trump's Hate March. Also, if anyone's interested in making posters, there's poster boards in the seminar room. Today at 4:30 p.m. in the chapel basement is the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Thursday at 11:30 a.m. in Winds, there will be a brown bag on Thought into Action, Women Making a Difference. If you need to leave during the presentation, please do so respectfully and quietly so as not to disturb the presenter. Please clean up around you. There's compost and trash cans in the back over there. And if you're here at the end of the brown bag, please help by putting the chairs back on the ground if you are able to. Thank you so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Taylor from the Department of Educational Studies.
All right, so how's my sound? Good? Okay. So I will put a plug in for using the mic. I know people I hate using a mic, but it's really important for accessibility reasons that we use mics. Whether or not we have people in the room who have hearing impairments kind of doesn't matter, right? Because everyone can benefit from the mic. So put in a plug for the mic. I am going to sit here. Yeah, okay. Makes me feel less weird. and I'll sit to the side so you can see so you can see the slides. So quick point, everything that's on the slides I will be either saying or describing. So for those of you in the back, if you can't see, I'll describe it for you. Okay, so you might have noticed that I changed the title of my talk. I had no idea how I would kind of proceed with the talk that I sort of envisioned when I put in the title in August. A lot has changed, it feels, and then also a lot has not changed. So that's kind of the tone of my talk, is to talk about where are we now, how do we understand where we are and what's happened, but also how do we move forward in ways that understand that we need to have a vision of interlocking forms of oppression that really include and understand what ableism is and how ableism upholds in particular white supremacy, which is what I'm going to be speaking about mostly today. So I hope this kind of makes sense. If it doesn't, please help me make sense of it, and we'll just kind of have a dialogue and have a conversation. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is I want to start on a positive note, and I want to talk to you about the Crypt the Vote initiative that started on Twitter. Has anyone heard of it? Crypt the Vote? Yeah, a few of you? Okay. So the Crypt the Vote initiative started on Twitter as a hashtag, and it was really meant to bring together people in the very diverse disability community to talk about the ways that they experience themselves as voters, right? And they experience especially things like inaccessibility of voting stations, a lack of access to transportation to get to voting, a lack of understanding of their rights relative to voting, which may seem kind of odd, right? Don't they have the right to vote? If you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. For people with disabilities, especially people with intellectual, cognitive disabilities, some people with traumatic brain injuries, it's not guaranteed that you actually can vote. There are several states in the country where people exist under guardianship restrictions so that they don't actually have the right to vote. So that's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about, right, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to have the right to vote? And it's not sort of guaranteed based on your level of ability. But the Crypt the Vote initiative was very successful in many ways. It brought about conversations on disability within the context of the election process that were never before seen, right? Social media really enabled that to happen. And like I said before, one of the main conversations was talking about this issue of guardianship. And the Crypt the Vote movement really supported the idea of minimizing the kind of restrictions that are on people, and theorizing differently the kinds of supports that people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities might need in order to participate in the voting process. So that's a huge thing. This is a big, big non-talked about issue relative to citizenship and voting access. They also asked candidates to really consider and think more carefully about how they were going to address the needs of people with disabilities. There was more conversation than usual, but a lot of it remained pretty vague, right? On the level of, well, it's not really clear what's actually going to happen. So that's something that we kind of need to talk about going forward. One of the main things is now that the election has happened, there's actually a tremendous lack of clarity on exactly how the Trump administration is going to affect people with disabilities. So a few things that we kind of do know, and I'll just go to my next slide. So on this slide, I've listed the things that I'll talk about, and on the left-hand side, sorry, your right-hand side of the screen, there's a picture of some activists in Colorado who have signs that say things like, world's cheapest healthcare, not dead yet, better off dead not, give me liberty, don't give me death, don't give me death. So what this is it's a picture of a protest in Colorado protesting a law that actually was passed. It was a down ballot initiative, so it's now, there's an assisted suicide bill in place in Colorado. So some of you might be thinking, well, maybe what does this have to do with disability directly? So people with disabilities, a lot of groups, disabled rights groups, have campaigned actively against assisted suicide bills in this country and in Canada and elsewhere because of the threat that it poses to not only the idea that they might be in a situation where they might be seen as having a life not worth living, but also the idea that a life that's lived with a disability is one that we might not want to live with, right? So if a person becomes disabled through an accident, they might perceive themselves, you might think, if you're an able-bodied person, there's a lot of perception that you would not be able to live that life, right? And so a lot of people who do live those lives with disabilities, think this is a problem for me because it basically suggests that my life is not worth living. And so that's the sort of campaign that's going on there. So we now know that in Colorado, at least, there is an assisted suicide bill. So that's one consequence of the election that we know. There's some concerns about how the possible changes to the Affordable Care Act will affect people with disabilities. We know that one of the things that's in the Affordable Care Act is you can't deny a person access to insurance on the basis of a pre-existing condition, right? There's some unclarity again about how that's going to actually carry through. Trump has said some very different things about that, so we have to kind of wait and see, but that's something that could really deeply affect people with disabilities. Just a couple other things. There's fear about changes to Medicaid funding. I could go into that if you're interested more later. And there's also some concerns about how the Trump administration will come down on the view of vaccines and the relationship between vaccines and autism. And so this is this kind of long conversation about how vaccines contribute to or cause autism. It's been very much debunked by the scientific community that there is a relationship between vaccines and autism, but there remains a conversation ongoing about among politicians that this is actually in fact the case. So whether or not you see that connection as being there is kind of also beside the point. More than anything, what we want to think about is why is there such a fear and phobia around autism to begin with? Okay, so that's the conversation that we're not having when we're having a conversation about whether or not vaccines cause autism, right? What does it mean to have a kind of view of autism as a pandemic? Okay. So I can say a little bit more also about the HIPAA, the changes, the possible changes that the Health Insurance Privacy Act would have, changes to that would have on people with mental illness. That's a concern. And then I've already spoken about the assisted suicide. So those are some like real sort of disability rights concerns that are in place right now that we just sort of don't really know what's going to happen. But I think that there is reason to think that there will be changes that will affect people with disabilities very materially and concretely in their lives. Now, that said, we've talked in this space before about the kind of difference between a disability rights perspective and a disability justice perspective. And a disability justice perspective really takes, so Leah Lakshmi Safarsinha, who came last year, spoke about this, about the disability justice movement, and how the disability justice movement doesn't see disability rights specifically as the focus of attention, but more so on the question of how do people's bodies and embodiment and experiences exist in ways that render them disabled, whether or not they're seen as disabled themselves, right? So there's all sorts of institutions and processes in society that structure people's bodies as non-welcome, right? And in many ways as having precarity in the world. So one of two main things here would be the school to prison pipeline and the prison industrial complex and the relationship that those play with disabilities. So the National Council on Disability has suggested that 85% of youth in juvenile facilities are eligible for special education services, which means that they've been labeled or are suspected to have a disability. So that's a hugely high number if you think about that. And it may seem odd to you until you know that a lot of youth of color, especially Latino and Black youth, are labeled with something called emotional behavioral disability or some variance around that can contribute to their pathway to incarceration. So this question of labeling practices that play a role in the kind of pathway to prison, that's something that disability justice groups are concerned about. And that is now, and it's been the case, and it hasn't changed, and it wouldn't have changed regardless of the outcome of the election. I hate to say that, but it's true, right? So we have to think about the ways that the election does and does not impact that kind of a concern, and how we still need to be thinking about that. Ableist violence is another big concern, right? The effect of violence towards people, directed towards people with disabilities, but also violence that's directed towards people's bodies that render them disabled, right? So that create disability through that kind of violence. And then also sexual agency and autonomy. So it may seem strange to you to think, well, what's that about, right? Not all people with disabilities have literally access to sex, right? So the question of having access, we need to have access to sex. That's a really important part. I can say that really loudly here, right? You need to have access to sex, right? That's a really important part of experiencing your identity for a lot of people, right? If not, fine, but it's for a lot of people, a really big part of their sexual their identity is sexual agency. So that's a big concern that continues. And then labor rights. So some people, there are bills to change this, but people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are sometimes exist in labor environments where they're not even paid a minimum wage. So they're working full time, and they're not being paid even a minimum wage. So it's kind of, you can see that as a kind of enslaved kind of labor, right? So there's concerns about how that affects people with disabilities, as well as imprisoned groups, and the effect that that has on their being. Okay. So, okay. So I want to say a few things about how ability and disability were manifest within the election as a kind of discourse around citizenship. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about how I see this connected to my original conversation that I wanted to have about special needs. Okay. So I've got a few images here. On the left-hand side is a picture of Trump's book called Crippled America. So there's a use of a term of ableism in the title of the book, right? A term that often gets used to capture a kind of idea about something being broken, right? It's also used to be a term that was used, but now is a derogatory term to refer to a person with a physical disability. I'm not going to even talk about the reporter who he mocked, or the incident of mocking the reporter, because I think we all kind of know about that incident. That's the picture up on the right-hand side of the screen, in which you see Trump making a gesture of a sort of slur gesture. And then this is the thing that I think is really interesting, and that might not be as apparent to everyone. So when Hillary became sick during the campaign, there was a lot of conversations about her competence, right? And one of the things that I thought as I sat there and listened to this is that not only were these conversations deeply gendered, right? Conversations about a woman's competence relative to holding a public leadership office, the biggest office, right? But also questions about where is the disability narrative going on here? What does it mean to suggest that a person is incompetent to hold office if they have some kind of, be it temporary or non-temporary disability or illness, right? I mean, think about that. Let that sink in for a second. We live in a country, and we live, I mean, even if we don't live in this country, many Western countries, maybe all, I don't know if I can make that claim, it's very unlikely that the person with a disability would get elected because of perceptions about competence that have to do with their physical embodiment, right? That's kind of big. So it's important to think about these kinds of conversations that were going on that maybe weren't as apparently about disability in the background, right? So then I realized, it would be fine if we sat here and we thought, well, these are really awful. I'm not a participant in this. This is something that I don't want to think about myself being part of. But we got to think about ourselves as being part of this whole structure. So let's try to theorize that. So one of the things that I started to notice is that in the kind of leading up to the election and then in the aftermath, in the kind of days after the election, right? I was seeing a lot of narratives pop up within popular media and Twitter around a kind of reading of Trump supporters, of Trump, and of the election results itself, and through a disability framing. So think about this. Michael Moore used the language of Trump as a sociopath. So it may be the case that we're really angry, but thinking about a person through the lens of sociopath is a way of thinking about them through the lens of mental illness, right? Same with this kind of, so there's a Salon article here that I've quoted, or that I've put the heading up, America, You're Stupid, Donald Trump's political track makes it official, we're a nation of idiots. So those of you who don't know, idiot was a term that was used within a scientific and educational context to describe people who are labeled with intellectual cognitive disabilities. It used to be called, and I would beg you not to ever use this terminology now, but mental retardation, right? So this is a term that we use. How many of you have used the term idiot? Right? Might be important to think about the history when we're thinking about using that term, right? What kind of history are we perpetuating by using that term? And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Here's another one from Twitter. This was on a Twitter feed that I was following that was actually kind of a tangential Twitter feed to the Crip the Vote conversation. So this I found kind of troubling. This person says, Trump is an unhinged lunatic. He is a jackass and does not care about anyone. Okay. So again, the language of lunacy. Lunacy was a term that was used to describe people with mental illness a long time ago. We still use that term too. Not as popular as the term idiot, but it still gets used. All right, so these are responses from people who are angry about the election, which is to say they're angry that Trump got elected. So these are people that we might kind of identify with. And I'm angry, and I can say that I'm angry. And I know that when you're angry, you tend to kind of go to those kinds of words, right? You kind of tend to go to those words that express that kind of rage. So okay, so let's kind of try to think about where these words come from and how to situate ourselves within them. All right, so for a long time, disability has been used as a way to demarcate people who are considered to be fit for citizenship and not fit for citizenship. So in fact, you could see disability as a kind of organizing concept for citizenship and civic membership. So let's just think of a few examples. So I've got this picture up here from Some Cards, which is a great card website. But this one is maybe less great. It says, once a month, women turn crazy for about 30 days. We've all heard those kind of narratives before, right? Okay. So that's an example that might just seem sort of like, okay, calling a woman crazy. The way of talking about women as having some kind of mental impairment or cognitive impairment in virtue of being a woman, that goes back forever, right? Aristotle said that women were mutilated men. Right? Okay, so gender and disability intertwine from the beginning. So the idea that women don't have as much cognitive competence or mental health competence, right, as men, this is something that's ingrained in the very definition of women. Okay, so here and then I have a picture of some suffragists, some white suffragists, and we might think about the suffragist movement that the way that suffragists were kind of dismissed was again through the narrative of mental unfitness, right, of non-fitness to be citizens. But we also need to think about how white women within the context of the suffragist movement used racialized discourse to deny women, black women in particular, the right to also be part of that voting access, right? So again, using the narratives of cognitive unfitness. Another image I have up here is of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. Anyone familiar with that? The DSM, okay, those of you in psych. So this is a big manual that lists all the kinds of disorders and illnesses, et cetera, right, including disabilities. So up until 1973, many of you might know this from your classes, homosexuality was included in the DSM as a mental illness. So again, I'm giving you these examples for us to think about the ways that disability has been brought back in as a way to understand, or as a way to push aside people whose expressions of their identity or whose experiences don't fit within a particular kind of paradigm of whiteness, which we'll talk about in a second. Final example would be, this is Ellis Island, and I've got a list of the different kinds of designations that people would be marked with when they came through Ellis Island. I think this is a particularly important one to be thinking about right now in the context of a lot of fears, that rightful, well-grounded fears that people have about their precarity as immigrants or precarity as undocumented people, or even people who might experience themselves as being seen as not belonging because of their color of their skin and their voice and their language that they use. So here in the Ellis Island, they use designations. So an X on your form would be that you were suspected of a mental deficit. An X with a circle would be that you have definite signs of mental disease observed. We can talk forever about what signs of mental disease are. We still kind of use those in the context of educational spheres. Something interesting to think about, the way that we read disability onto people's bodies based on characteristics of their bodies. Okay, so these are a few examples that I wanted to give you of the way that disability is used to pathologize, or disability as pathology is used to pathologize people's bodies that fit into these other categories. So again, back to this kind of organizing concept. Okay, so I have this long quote that I was like, oh God, when the study's lunchtime talk, I'm not going to read this long quote, but I am going to read this long quote because it's by some colleagues of mine who are fantastic and awesome. And this is a kind of way of framing a conversation that gets us away from thinking that it's all about these kind of overt ways of being violent and situating people on the margins of society. Okay. So they say, this is D.L. Adams and Nirmala Arabats, we need to look at the violent material practices by which race and disability coalesce at the intersections of gender identity, sexuality, and class, that enable the fatal dislocation of certain marked bodies as matter out of white normative space or place. But not all dislocations are fatal, and this is important. And not all dislocating practices are readily recognizable by an outraged public, nor are all perpetrators and victims easily identified in these dislocations. In fact, because some dislocating practices are so obviously violent, they serve to obscure other normalized everyday practices enacted by seemingly well-intentioned individuals to dislocate bodies in classrooms, families, and communities. Okay, in other words, it's important that we look at these maybe overt contexts, including the kind of symbolism of legitimating the kind of language that we've seen, the language of ableism, the language of racism, the language of sexism and misogyny and classism and transphobia and homophobia and all of those languages. But we also have to look at ourselves in the way that our continued practices that aren't overtly seen as violent continue to marginalize people, and in the context that I'm talking about, people with disabilities. So this brings me back to maybe the reason you came, which is to talk about special needs, which I'll now talk about. All right. So recently, I was with a group of friends, and people that I sort of know a little bit, don't know that well. And somebody said, well, they were talking about a person that they don't really like very much, which maybe was not a good start. And then they said, well, actually, but I think she has special needs. And they said it in a way that made me think, well, that's kind of weird. But I think what they meant to do was to kind of understand or empathize with the fact that maybe this person might be odd to them, or they might not like them, but maybe their behaviors could be explained by their disability. So it's important for them to acknowledge that this person might have a disability. They might know somehow that she has been diagnosed or maybe labeled, or might be reading something onto her body. And so then I thought, okay, I like the sentiment in a way that we might be empathetic to people's differences, but, and probably you anticipated this coming, it also deeply troubled me because there's a way that then we kind of deny them something, right? Something about their personhood, something about their agency, something about the fact that maybe they're just unlikable. And there's a part of me that doesn't want to deny people the possibility of being unlikable just because they have a disability. So do you see the tension here? So I started thinking, when I thought about this talk a while back, I thought to myself, I think we need to theorize this idea of both suggesting that a person has special needs, or I've heard it in the context of autism before, oh, I think he's autistic, I think that's why he acts that way, right? That we need to understand what we're doing when we use that kind of a framing of a person. That we might think that we're being very empathetic and caring, but in fact we might be participating in these same kinds of discourses that marginalize and keep people out of sort of belonging as citizens, right? So in order to theorize this, I thought to myself, well, first we have to look at the terminology, special needs. So how many of you have used this word before, or thought about this word before, or heard this word before? Okay, fine, heard this word, yes, right? So this is a word that we think of as like a good word, right? This is like a good word for disability. Like we're uncomfortable, many of us, we've stopped using the term handicap, that's definitely a plus, let's stop that for sure. We don't use language that's even more derogatory, right? We haven't heard the word cripple in a long time, except maybe in the title of Trump's book. And also, might have noticed in Crip the Vote, that's being reclaimed. That's a different kind of thing, right? But we don't see those words happening as much anymore. But special needs is a nice word, or nice term, right? Special needs is a nice term. We can say, I want to work with special needs kids when I grow up, right? We can say that without having a kind of weirdness about it. What's implied by this term? Let's think about it. So special needs, right? What does it mean when something's special? Tell me. Different, out of the ordinary, unique.
They don't fit them all. Well, I guess that's the definition of different.
Sure, that can be the definition of that. Different from something, right? Different relationally. Special is kind of a word that we go, that's special, right? That is the kind of word that we use that's very euphemistic. It's an incredibly euphemistic term. Special education, special needs, right? These are the kinds of terms that we use because we don't want to say they have bad needs, or their needs aren't easy, or they don't fit within the norm, right? It's a euphemistic way of talking about a person. It's also very strange. I was reading a blog earlier today, and somebody pointed out that the term special needs is a way of saying, like, imagine this, for example, if my special need is that I need to use a feeding tube in order to feed, in order for me to actually get the nourishment that I need. How is that a special need? That's just a need that I have to eat in a particular way, right? There's nothing special about that need. It's a need that we all have as humans. So the word special operates as a way, I'm arguing, that it operates as a way to distance ourselves from that person but also to distance that person from the context of what we might see as normalcy, or we might see as belonging, or we might see as like civic membership. So I want to suggest, and I think I sort of promised myself I'd talk for maybe about 30 minutes, and then we can open it up for conversations. I think maybe I've done that, I'm not sure. I want to suggest that we think about how this term special needs and our kind of conversations that we're having about disability really enable the kinds of marginalization that we see going on of people with disabilities all the time. So that our use of these kinds of terms and our understanding of people with special needs, people with these kinds of disabilities that we place into that category, that we're seeing them as wholly other, right? We're seeing them as wholly other, especially and maybe particularly people who are labeled and marked with developmental disabilities, autism, intellectual disability. We see them as non-participants in our society. And I think if we understand that mental deficiency has been used for centuries to demarcate people who we might now understand very much that this was a problem, that for whom this was a problem, that we now continue to use those same kinds of ideas and language to actually marginalize people we see and understand through the lens of disability, that's a huge problem, right? We can't rely on this kind of history. We can't rely on this kind of narratives about mental deficiency. So let's stop using special needs, perhaps. But also let's theorize what it means when we put ourselves in that camp of being sort of the good people who are considerate of the people with special needs and how they might belong. Yeah, that's where I want to stop. Okay, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you for your talk. I learned a lot. In regards to, so I guess my question is there a word that should be like better used, or should we not like use any sort of word like that like demarcates like someone having a disability, or is the word like disability, or kind of just like saying that like someone like might have like autism, but like, that's just like one part of like who they are, and like naming that in that way, like, or should we just like not name anything? Like, I guess that was my question.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thanks. Yeah, the naming question is really important, and I'm glad that came up. Is this on? So I'm glad you asked that. So my first thought is, I think Barb, and I can't remember her last name, who came to talk. Who came to talk a few weeks ago. She said this, and I think it was perfectly the right answer, which is that always ask a person their preferred kind of terminology, right? Whatever their identity position is. But I will say that the question for me is less about the kind of terms that we use and more about what the terms do. So the reason that I'm pointing out special needs is because I think special needs operates in this weird area of sort of making us feel good and safe and happy, right? And it's not a term that makes people labeled with that term feel very special and safe and happy. So I think it's more about, like, I'm sure that you've heard I'm sure you know people who will say something like, well, he's gay, or he's black, right? In that kind of way of whispering it to yourself. Let's not do that with disability. Let's not try to move ourselves away and differentiate ourselves in the way that we do in the way that special needs as a kind of label helps us. So, I mean, the first thing would be to say, yes, ask the person. I prefer to say a person with a disability, unless the person tells me differently. That's often the term that's used and people are happy with. Some people prefer, if for example, there are autistic people who prefer to be called autistic people, or Aspies, or autists, or other kinds of language like that. So there's lots of different terms. But I would beg us not to be sort of happy with the kind of ones that make us feel special and safe and good. Yeah.
Hi. Again, I want to thank you too. I think this is really helpful. I guess my kind of question is, we're talking about a lot of disability justice and disability rights, but I'm also wondering, how do we kind of make practices that, or I guess, how do we acknowledge the fact that people are differently abled, but at the same time not marginalize them through that differentiating? So I think through a lot of isms in general, there's a lot of this, like, by differentiating, we also marginalize. So I'm just wondering if there's any practices that you know, or any ways that people who are able-bodied, and I use quotations because what does it mean to be able-bodied? Because it's a spectrum. But I'm kind of wondering, are there any kind of tips or things that you see as practical to use?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, that's a really good question. So let me make sure I understand the question. So there's kind of a tension in a way between like terminology, but also a kind of perception of ourselves that there's like there are able-bodied people and there are disabled people. And some of the concern is that we acknowledge that, right, that there are these kinds of differences in bodies, but also not understand ourselves as we all exist in a sort of space of ability and disability at all times. Is that partly what you're asking? Okay, that's a really good question. So thought about this a lot. There seems to me like two things to go on here. One is that whether or not differences become disabilities is really tricky and weird and depends a lot on the kind of other identities that you occupy, right? So an example would be glasses. Why is it that wearing glasses is not seen as a disability in society in a way that having a vision impairment that sort of falls on like a weird and arbitrary and kind of strange to define line, all of a sudden you become part of a kind of disability kind of position, right? So the first thing to acknowledge would be that like whether or not a disability even, or just a difference, a bodily difference becomes a disability is kind of, it's not always clear how that works. The second thing is that there is a way that we occupy positions of able-bodiedness and disabledness that is based on privilege, and that isn't really about the differences that we actually have, but it's about the perception of our bodies by others, right? So understanding that I occupy a space of able-bodied privilege while also acknowledging that my body has limitations is something that I feel like that's the tension that we always have to hold. So how do you understand yourself as someone who has a body that experiences limitations while also understanding that that isn't socially understood through the lens of disability, which is to say that you have let's say, I have no idea, that you have able-bodied privilege. I'll say that about myself, right? So I might experience all sorts of things about the limitations of my body, but I also know that I'm perceived in a particular way as privileged, and or as non-disabled, and that I experience privilege on that basis. So what I say to my students, some of whom are here, maybe out here, tell me if this is true or not true that I say this, but that you have to, I think that there's a way that you have to be thinking about yourself always in occupying those two positions. The weirdness about disability is that because so many disabilities are invisible, it's never apparent, or it's not always apparent to us, the kinds of experiences that people are having. So we have to always understand ourselves as like potential allies, but also never allies in a weird way. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but it is one where it's about holding together those tensions. The more we differentiate ourselves, the less we acknowledge that actually ability is very fluid and really depends a lot on context and where we are on a given day mentally.
Kind of going, it was on. Okay. Kind of going off what you just said. So like recently I've been hearing people say like not to use disabled, but to use differently abled. And is that something that like able-bodied people came up with to make themselves feel better, or is it something that came from the disabled community?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
So I can't say this with like for sure certainty, but I'm pretty confident that that is a term that is originated from the non-disabled community, which is to say that falls again under a kind of euphemistic term. I don't think I've ever, that's not fair. Maybe like one or two times I've heard a person who identifies as having a disability refer to themselves as differently abled. It's very frequently a term that people who consider themselves or are seen as able-bodied will use, so it falls again into that kind of euphemistic camp. I think, again, it goes back to what people prefer. If a person prefers differently abled or differently embodied or whatever kind of term, respect that, right? But I do think that for the most part, I think there's a lot of people in the disabled community and the disability community who acknowledge the fact that these terms make things pretty and they're not really acknowledging the kinds of material realities that they have, right? So I don't want to say that it didn't, because I don't really actually know that history and I wouldn't want to say it with confidence, but I've very rarely heard, I've almost never heard that term referred to from a person with disability. Very often heard it from people who consider themselves able-bodied.
I'll ask a question. Thank you so much for this. I think all the questions speak to how little attention we've been giving to disability justice and activism in our space. I was wondering if you might be able to talk about the disability so white hashtag movement, if you know about that, and what, particularly with autism, is sometimes seen as just acting out in children of color or in girl children, whereas white, usually male children are seen as oh, let's get you special testing, let's get early detection, whatever. For a lot of disabilities, I think sometimes it's seen as the diagnosis process, I guess. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that with gender and race.
Yeah, this is good. This is so. Oh my God, there's so many weird things. Okay, so first of all, yes, the disability studies, disability rights community has been historically extremely white, right? So that's one thing. That's why this disability justice community has emerged. Well, it's not why, but it's partly why, as a response to that kind of whiteness that's prevailed within the disability community. With respect to I can speak directly about education because that's what I know best, but within the context of education, disabilities are perceived in kids radically differently depending on the color of their skin and the kind of communities that they come from. So I think I mentioned earlier about emotional and behavioral disturbance or oppositional defiance disorder, which are the kinds of behavioral and sort of weirdly fall into the psychiatric disability kind of camp that often gets marked onto Black and Latino and Indigenous boys in schools, right? Boys in particular, although girls too. So that's a very gendered and very racialized kind of a category, and it's what is seen to and understood to account for a lot of the overrepresentation within this context of special education. And what I mean by that is overrepresentation refers to the fact that with the number of kids that you have in schools, the number of, say, Black kids that you have in schools, you'd think that there would be a proportionate number based on the number of white kids are in schools is having I'm not doing this very well, that there would be a proportionate number of kids who are labeled with particular disabilities, but there isn't. There's a disproportionate number. So that such that especially Black boys, especially Latino boys, and to a certain extent Indigenous boys, get marked with disability more readily than white kids, right? So that's one thing. Second thing, other disability categories are actually overrepresented in whiteness. So learning disability is kind of a complicated one, but a lot of the time learning disability kind of intersects with class identities and class dimensions. And historically, learning disability emerged as a category because white parents were upset that their kids were struggling in school and they didn't know how to understand that their kids were intelligent, right? My kid is intelligent, but I don't know how to understand that my kid is struggling in school. And so this label actually emerged as a way to make sense of that didn't have to be intellectual or cognitive disability, because that was seen as oh no, that's no good, we don't want that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, there are lots of ways to take this. It's a big problem, right? It's a big problem within education. It's a big problem culturally that disability has been theorized so much in relation to white bodies. Even maybe I hesitate to say especially, but maybe especially even within the women's studies, women's movement, etc.
Over here for,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you want to say something, Professor Taylor, about feminist disability studies and courses that you will offer in the future and what they might do?
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I'm hoping, looking at Professor Palmer at the back because I haven't told him this yet. I'm hoping that I could teach.
Have my blessing.
I'm hoping that I can teach a feminist disability studies class next year that would be a dedicated feminist disability studies class. So next, maybe, I don't know if it would be, but depending on our needs in the department, fall or spring. So that would be great if people are interested in that. I am teaching a course called Disability, Difference, and Inclusion in the spring that is, I've kind of put it as, it has a prereq right now as inclusive and special ed, but I'm willing to waive that because there are some more seats and I think people are kind of intimidated by the prereq. So for that, if you are interested, we will be talking a lot about feminist disability studies, or we will be using a lot of text, especially and particularly to understand developmental disabilities, autism, and intellectual disability. That's sort of where we're focusing. Yeah, thanks for asking that. Yeah, so let me know if you're interested. Come talk to me after if you want into that class and you want me to waive the requirement.
Sorry.
Monday, Wednesday, 1:20.
There you go. Rachel says it's Monday, Wednesday, 1:20. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks so much for the info. So right here. I wanted to know what kind of role that diagnoses play in the stigmatization of disabilities. I'm speaking specifically of, like, my family, like, because I can't speak for the community of color as a whole, where, like, if you're not diagnosed, then it's not an issue. And so then it's like, you're just struggling, right? And so, like, but on the other hand, if there was, like, you know, what, like, who, if we had money or the insurance to get that kind of diagnosis to, like, oh, yes, this is actually something that's happening in this body, like, then we could take steps as, like, I'm thinking of, like, my family towards, like, what we can do and, like, being better about that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you asked that, because this is the kind of complexity of the critique of disability, especially disability diagnoses, is that there's a sort of over-reliance on medical diagnostics. There's a problem of the way that the medical world has historically understood and also currently understands and thinks about disability. On the other hand, it can be incredibly empowering and what's the word I'm looking for? Reassuring, that's not the right word, for a person to be diagnosed, because it all of a sudden you're sort of like, oh my God, that's what's been happening, right? So both that, and there's this other thing that I think you're speaking to, which is that having a diagnosis means that you have access to services that without that diagnosis you don't have. So especially for kids who are struggling in schools, getting a diagnosis can be a double-edged sword for many kids, because one, it does bring along with it a lot of stigma, and also a lot of associations that may or may not actually be the case for that student. So imagine if you're diagnosed with an intellectual disability, this is the area I know the most about. If you're diagnosed with an intellectual disability, it may or may not mean anything about certain abilities that you have, right? It may mean that you have some trouble with learning. It may mean that you have trouble with adaptive kinds of behavior, whatever, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have any trouble with a particular thing. So diagnostics can, like, sort of over-inform us, but at the same time, they provide us with the means to get services that we need, right? So not having a diagnosis means that you're sort of left out in the world, right? So I think I don't know if that answers the question, but I don't want to in any way come down saying that I think diagnostics don't have a place in the world, because they absolutely do. But it's kind of also troubling to think that in order for people to get the services and supports that they need, we also have to make them exist in a medical world in a way that might be really bad for them.
Can I ask another question? I was wondering if, and I've heard you talk about this in intergroup dialogue settings a little bit, but just because there's students and faculty in this space, like, what advice do you have for both, like, students and faculty and, like, bridging the accommodations gap? Because sometimes there's so much, like, disbelief or, like, burden of proof on students with disabilities or with different needs, to make sure that, like, their needs are met, and the faculty sometimes there's, like,
That's
reluctance.
That's a really good question. The first thing, I hate to say this, but I have been hearing a lot of stories recently of situations in which students have not, how do I put this nicely? Students have not been receiving the services to which they are legally entitled. I don't know. I almost want to say, like, if you think that might be the case for you, come talk to me, because I know the law well enough to tell you if you're probably being denied something that you're legally entitled to. I'm happy to talk. Also, I mean, I assume Lynn Waldman knows that law as well. So do ask those questions, because you do actually have rights. I mean, I don't know, but I'm happy to talk to you about what I know about those rights. So that would be my first thing, is to say there are, like, some pretty clear-cut situations in which I've heard stories that it seems clear to me that student is not getting their legal right entitlement. Secondly, I would say it's incumbent. It's a lot of it is education. There's a lot of lack of understanding about what exactly faculty have to do relative to the law, but also what it means to actually support a student without intervening on the kind of quality of the education that you want them to receive, and also intervening on, like, your sort of freedom of expression, whatever. As a professor, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. There's also a lot of prejudice about the idea that a student who can't sort of, focus on an exam for whatever normal decided time we've imposed on them, that they can focus on that somehow they shouldn't be here, right? And I think that that's not, I don't want to say that that's the faculty who are the majority of people thinking that. I think a lot of students have that perception. And so there's like a lot of layered parts to that in terms of how we inform ourselves about what it means to have a disability relative to an educational context. I don't know, I could go on about this. My first thing would be to say, if you're in a situation where you're not sure if you're getting what you're legally entitled to, do some reading, do some research, come and ask me. I'm happy to tell you if it's a rights thing or not. I think also I'd be happy to do more like those kinds of IGD things where we talk about how to understand ourselves as faculty in relation to student needs. I think it's just informing and knowing more, and also changing our attitudes. I think that this is going to make me go on my soapbox, but like I do think that the understanding the university as a place where people have a particular kind of intellectual and physical and pace and stamina kind of ability and mental health is just something that we can't hold on to anymore. That is not a 21st century mode of thinking. That's not an inclusive way of thinking. It doesn't acknowledge the kind of history that we've had and excluded people from education.
So this might be slightly unrelated, but what you were just saying kind of made me think about trigger warnings and how that comes back from spaces. So I don't know if you could talk a bit about that.
Ooh, where to start with that? Oh, I think that's a hard question. So I'll say something that I know a little bit about because I may be giving a talk about this next semester, but I think one of the things that I worry about, I'll just say this because it relates to our conversation. One of the things I worry about with the conversation around trigger warnings is that there's a kind of misunderstanding about mental health and students' experiences with mental health that's actually going on in those conversations. So at the same time as I think we have to be deeply concerned about our students' mental health, we also have to understand that that PTSD and mental health don't necessarily operate in the ways that the conversations about trigger warning that are happening actually, I'm putting this wrong, that the conversations about trigger warnings don't get it quite right. So it may be the case that students are experiencing a kind of traumatic situation, but it may or may not be related to the particularities of what's happening in the classroom. I mean, I think the question of how we create classroom spaces that are safe for students and that they can experience themselves and their identities as safe, but that also allow for us to have really deep and important conversations where we do actually grapple with tense ideas. That's like, I don't know, there were books written about this. I mean, I don't even know, I'm not sure I can answer it fully right now. But I will say that for me, one of the areas that I'm concerned about is the kind of discourse around mental health that is operating. And I think we have to kind of get it right and understand what people are actually experiencing rather than sort of having very general hand-wavy ideas about what how mental health exists on campus. We're going to talk about that more next semester.
Any other questions? Let's thank Professor Jerry.